Question 1. During an emergency response where multiple areas are impacted, a company enters into an agreement with a logistics provider for expedited supply delivery. The contract specifies that time is of the essence. However, due to unforeseen circumstances, the logistics provider fails to deliver on time, causing financial losses to the company. The logistics provider argues that it should not be liable because the delay was beyond its control. Which of the following legal principles is most relevant in determining liability? A. Force majeure clause. B. Substantial performance doctrine. C. Anticipatory repudiation. D. Parallel evidence rule. Answer A. Force majeure clause. Explanation. A force majeure clause relieves a party from liability if unforeseen events beyond their control prevent contract performance. Courts assess if the event qualifies under the clause and whether reasonable steps were taken to mitigate damages. Substantial performance doctrine B applies when minor breaches still fulfill the contract's essential purpose, which does not apply here since timely delivery was critical. Anticipatory repudiation C involves one party indicating it will not fulfill its contractual obligations before the deadline, which is not the case in this scenario. Parallel evidence rule D limits the use of extrinsic evidence to modify written contracts but is not relevant to determining liability for non-performance. Relevant law. Restatement. Second of Contracts SS 261 Discharge by Supervision. Impracticability and Uniform Commercial Code UC SS 2 615 Excuse by failure of presupposed conditions. Question 2. When improving a process that shows unexpected results, a technology firm contracts with a software developer to create a custom application. The agreement requires the software to function seamlessly with the firm's existing system. However, once delivered, the software fails to integrate properly, rendering it useless. The firm seeks to rescind the contract and recover payments. The software developer claims that it has fulfilled its obligations, delivered a functioning product. Which of the following is the strongest legal basis for rescission? A. Unilateral mistake. B. Impossibility of performance. C. Frustration of purpose. D. Breach of an express condition. Answer D. Breach of an express condition. Explanation. Contracts often contain express conditions that must be strictly met before obligations arise. Here, integration with the firm's system was likely an essential condition, meaning failure to meet it constitutes material breach. Courts typically enforce explicit conditions strictly. Unilateral mistake A applies when only one party is mistaken about contract term, but no evidence suggests firm misunderstood the contract. Impossibility of performance B applies when performance becomes objectively impossible. E.g. destruction of subject matter, which is not the case here. Frustration of purpose. C. Discharges obligations if an unforeseen event destroys the contract's fundamental purpose. However, the issue here is non-performance rather than external frustration. Relevant law. Restatement. Second of Contracts SS 224 Condition Defined and UC SS 2 601 Perfect Tender Rule. Question 3. In a case where multiple parties have different objectives, a contractor agrees to build a commercial property under a contract specifying payment upon the substantial completion of the project. Near completion, the owner refuses to release payment, arguing that minor defects remain. The contractor insists that the defects do not prevent functional use and demands payment. How should a court likely resolve this dispute? A. The contractor is entitled to full payment because substantial completion has occurred. B. The owner is justified in withholding payment because the contract requires absolute perfection. C. The contractor is entitled to partial payment, subject to an offset for the cost of correcting minor defects. D. The owner can rescind the contract due to the defects even if they are minor. Answer. C. The contractor is entitled to partial payment, subject to an offset for the cost of correcting minor defects. Explanation. Under the substantial performance doctrine, a contractor who substantially completes a project is entitled to payment with deductions for minor defects. Courts balance fairness by allowing owners to recover costs for uncorrected issues while ensuring contractors receive compensation for work performed. Option A is incorrect because full payment is only justified if there are no outstanding defects. Option B is incorrect because absolute perfection is not required in most construction contracts unless explicitly stated. Option D is incorrect because rescission is typically reserved for material breaches, not minor defects. Relevant law. Restatement. Second of contracts SS 237, effect on other parties' duties of failure to render performance, and Jacob and Yuns v. Kent 230 N. Y. 239 1921 substantial performance rule. Question 4. In a multi-location scenario where consistency requirements must be met across different departments, the supplier agrees to provide raw materials under a contract with a specified delivery schedule. The supplier, however, fails to deliver the materials on time, causing a disruption in the production process. The buyer, facing the delay, sends a letter to the supplier notifying them of their intention to terminate the contract due to breach. The supplier claims that the delay was caused by unforeseen transportation issues and that the contract should not be terminated. What is the most relevant legal principle to evaluate whether the buyer can terminate the contract without incurring liability for wrongful termination? A. Material breach and termination. B. Substantial performance doctrine. C. Impossibility of performance. D. Conditions precedent and subsequent. Answer: A. Material breach and termination. Explanation: in contract law, a material breach occurs when a party fails to perform a critical element of the contract, rendering it impossible for the other party to achieve the contract's primary objective. In this case, the supplier's failure to deliver raw materials on time disrupts the buyer's operations and could constitute material breach, which justifies contract termination. Material breach: a non-breaching party to terminate the contract and seek damages. Substantial performance doctrine B applies when party has performed the bulk of its contractual duties and only minor defects remain. This doctrine is not relevant because the supplier's failure to meet the delivery schedule may be considered material breach rather than minor non-performance. Impossibility of performance C applies when performance becomes impossible due to circumstances outside the control of the parties, such as the death of party or destruction of subject matter. The supplier's transportation issue, unless catastrophic, is not likely to qualify as an excuse for performance. Conditions precedent and subsequent D involve events that either trigger parties' obligation to perform or discharge obligations. This is not the key issue here, as the focus is on whether material breach occurred. Relevant law. Restatement of contracts SS 240 on circumstances affecting materiality of breach. Question 5. During a critical transition period where existing processes are being overhauled, a company enters into a contract with a consulting firm for strategic planning services. The contract contains a clause that specifies payment is due upon the completion of the plan. After several months, the consultant submits an incomplete version of the plan that does not meet the criteria outlined in the contract. The company refuses to pay it, claiming that the consultant has not met the agreed-upon terms. The consultant argues that the partial submission fulfills their contractual obligation. Which of the following is the most appropriate legal principle for the court to apply in determining whether the company is obligated to pay the consultant? A. Substantial performance doctrine. B. Breach of an express condition. C. Promissory estoppel. D. Impossibility of performance. Answer: B. Breach of an express condition. Explanation: in this case, the contract specifies that payment is due upon the completion of the plan, which appears to be an express condition. The consultant's partial submission likely fails to satisfy the condition of completion, meaning the consultant has not fully performed their contractual obligation. Under contract law, if an express condition is not met, the party whose performance is conditioned can withhold payment. Substantial performance doctrine A would allow for claim of payment despite minor deviations from the contract, but it does not apply here because the partial submission likely does not fulfill the fundamental purpose of the contract, which is the complete plan. Promissory estoppel C applies in situations where party relies on promise. A detriment, but this doctrine is generally used when there is no enforceable contract. Here there is contract that is governed by its express terms. Impossibility of performance D would apply if the consultant were unable to perform due to unforeseen circumstances, but there is no indication that it was impossible for the consultant to complete the plan. Relevant law. Restatement second of contracts SS 229 condition defined. Question 6. When dealing with a complex system that shows occasional performance failures, a company enters into a long-term service contract with a software provider. The agreement includes a warranty provision that promises the software will function without defect for a certain period. However, after the warranty period expires, the software begins to experience technical problems that the provider fails to fix in a timely manner. The company seeks to the warranty cause to recover costs associated with the repairs. Which of the following best describes the legal rights of the company under these circumstances? A. Warranty is an express term and breach. B. Implied warranty of merchantability. C. Mutual mistake. D. Force majeure clause. Answer A. Warranty as an express term and breach. Explanation. In this case, the warranty provided by the software provider is likely an express term of the contract, specifically promising that the software will function without defect for a certain period. If the software fails after the warranty period, the company would typically be entitled to a remedy only if the failure is within the scope of the warranty, assuming the problem arose during the warranty period. Failure to fix the issue promptly could be considered a breach of contract. Implied warranty of merchantability. B. Applies to goods sold, ensuring that the goods are of average quality and fit for their intended purpose. This is more relevant in a sales context and would not necessarily apply to services like software provision unless specified. Mutual mistake. C. Applies when both parties share a mistaken belief about a material fact of a contract's formation, which is not evident here. Force majeure clause. D. Would excuse performance if a party is unable to perform due to unforeseen events, but this clause does not seem relevant here, as the issue appears to be a defect in the software rather than an external event. Relevant law, Uniform Commercial Code Arc. SS2 314 implied warranty of merchantability and restatement. Second of Contracts SS 135 performance as condition. Question 7. While investigating a complicated issue between different parties, a business signs a contract to purchase certain equipment with payment due upon delivery. The seller delivers the equipment late, but it still performs as expected. The buyer, however, withholds payment, claiming that the late delivery was a breach of contract. The seller argues that the late delivery does not warrant withholding payment, as the equipment functions correctly. Legal principle that most likely governs the seller's argument. A. Material breach versus minor breach. B. Conditions precedent. C. Anticipatory repudiation. D. Mirror image rule. Answer A. Material breach versus minor breach. Explanation. In this case, the issue is whether the seller's late delivery constitutes material breach or minor breach. Material breach allows the non-breaching party to withhold payment or terminate the contract, while minor breach does not. Here, while the equipment was delivered late, it still performed as expected. Late delivery may be considered minor breach that does not justify withholding, especially if the equipment's performance was not affected. Conditions precedent. B. Are conditions that must occur before parties' obligation to perform arises, but there is no evidence here that the delivery date was condition precedent to payment. Anticipatory repudiation. C. Occurs when one party informs the other of an intention to breach the contract before the time for performance. This does not apply here, as the seller has performed, though late. Mirroring. Rule D applies to the acceptance of offers, stating that the acceptance must exactly match the offer. This rule does not apply in the context of breach of contract for late delivery. Relevant law. Restatement. Second of Contracts SS 241. Circumstances affecting materiality of breach. Question 8. In a high-stakes environment where multiple challenges arise, a software development company enters into a contract with a client for the development of a new application. The agreement stipulates that the application must be delivered in full within 6 months. However, the software company delivers the application with several features omitted, claiming that those features were unnecessary for the basic functionality of the app. The client refuses to accept delivery, claiming the application is incomplete. What legal principle applies to determine whether the client is entitled to reject the software delivery? A. Perfect tender rule. B. Substantial performance doctrine. C. Impossibility of performance. D. Contractual modification. Answer A. Perfect tender rule. Explanation. Under the perfect tender rule, if the goods delivered or services performed fail in any way to meet the terms of the contract, the buyer has the right to reject the delivery if the software delivered does not meet the specific requirements outlined in the contract, as key features were omitted. Since the client is entitled to a full application as agreed, they can reject the partial delivery. Substantial doctrine. B applies when a party has performed most of the contract and only minor defects remain, but this does not apply here because the failure to include important features is A significant deviation from the agreement, impossibility of performance. C applies when performance becomes impossible due to unforeseen events, which does not seem to be the case here. Contractual modification. D would apply if the parties agreed to change the contract terms, but there is no evidence here of any modification to the original agreement. Relevant law. RCS 2 6001 Perfect Tender Rule and Restatement. Second of Contracts SS 237 Effect on other parties' duties of failure to render performance. Question 9. When developing a solution that must address opposing needs, a company enters into a contract with a third-party vendor for the provision of services. The contract includes an arbitration clause stating that any dispute will be resolved through binding arbitration. A dispute arises regarding the quality of services provided, but one party refuses to arbitrate, claiming that the contract is void due to a mutual mistake of fact. The services to be rendered. Which of the following principles will likely govern the determination of the contract's enforceability? A. Mutual mistake. B. Specific performance. C. Anticipatory repudiation. D. Parallel evidence rule. Answer A. Mutual mistake. Explanation. A mutual mistake occurs when both parties are mistaken about a material fact that forms the basis of the contract. If both parties misunderstood the essential terms of the contract, such as the scope of services to be provided, this could render the contract voidable. In this case, the claim of mutual mistake might be raised by one party to argue that the contract is unenforceable due to a misunderstanding about the services. Specific performance. B is a remedy that compels a party to perform the terms of a contract, usually used in cases involving unique goods or services. However, this does not apply in the context of a mistake regarding the contract's subject matter. Anticipatory repudiation, C, occurs when one party expresses an intent not to perform their obligations before performance is due. This is not relevant here. The issue is about a mutual mistake regarding the contract, not an intention to avoid performance. Parallel evidence rule. D prevents the introduction of oral statements or prior written agreements that contradict a written contract. However, the parallel evidence rule is typically used when interpreting the terms of a written agreement, not when determining if the contract was formed based on a mutual mistake. Relevant law. Restatement. Second. Contracts SS 152 when mistake of both parties makes contract voidable. Question 10. In a situation where performance depends on certain factors being met, a manufacturer enters into a contract with a retailer for the delivery of exclusive goods, stipulating that payment is due upon delivery. The retailer, facing financial issues, fails to pay on time, although the manufacturer delivers the goods as agreed. The manufacturer demands payment and threatens legal action. The retailer argues that their failure to pay was due to unforeseen financial difficulties, claiming that it should excuse their failure to pay on time. Which legal concept best applies to this defense? A. Impossibility of performance. B. Temporary impossibility in performance excuse. C. Excuse of performance due to frustration of purpose. D. Temporary impossibility in commercial impracticability. Answer. B. Temporary impossibility in performance excuse. Explanation. In this case, the retailers claim that unforeseen financial difficulties caused their failure to pay may invoke the concept of temporary impossibility or an excuse for performance. Although the retailer faces financial hardship, it is typically not a defense for non-performance unless it renders the performance literally impossible. Courts generally do not excuse payment obligation due to financial difficulties unless they meet the criteria for impossibility or frustration. Impossibility of performance applies when performance of the contract is literally impossible due to unforeseen circumstances, but financial issues alone do not generally constitute impossibility. Excuse of performance due to frustration of purpose, C, occurs when an event undermines the core purpose of the contract, but here the retailer's failure due to financial problems, not frustration of the purpose of the contract itself. Temporary impossibility and commercial impracticability, D, applies when performance is not impossible but commercially unreasonable due to extraordinary circumstances. Financial difficulty could be considered form of impracticability, but courts do not often grant excuses for non-payment unless the conditions for impracticability are met. Relevant law. Uniform Commercial Code UC SS2 615 excused by performance as commercial impracticability and restatement. Second of Contracts SS 261 discharged by impossibility. Question 11. In a complex contractual relationship involving multiple parties, a buyer and seller enter into a contract for the purchase of rare artwork. The contract stipulates that the buyer will receive the artwork upon payment. The seller, however, decides to sell the artwork to another buyer at a higher price, breaching the original contract. The first buyer sues for damages, claiming that the seller's actions constitute wrongful act that entitles compensation. What is the most likely legal principle that would apply to the buyer's claim? A. Breach of contract and expectation damages. B. Punitive damages for wrongful act. C. Specific performance of contract. D. Mitigation of damages. Answer A. Breach of contract and expectation damages. Explanation. In this scenario, the seller's actions of selling the artwork to another buyer constitute a breach of contract. The expectation damages rule aims to compensate the non-breaching party for the loss they incurred as a result of the breach, effectively placing them in the position they would have been in had the contract been performed as agreed. This would typically cover the price difference between the agreed price and the price the buyer would have paid. Punitive damages for wrongful act B are generally awarded in cases involving malicious, fraudulent, or grossly negligent conduct. Breach of contract cases typically do not involve punitive damages unless the breach is coupled with fraud or other egregious behavior. Specific performance of contract C is a remedy that compels a party to perform the terms of the contract. It is typically used. Monetary damages are inadequate. G. For unique goods like real estate or rare artwork, but the buyer might prefer financial compensation instead. Mitigation of damages. D. is a legal principle requiring the non-breaching party to take reasonable steps to reduce their damages. In this case, while the buyer must mitigate their damages, the primary legal principle for breach claim is expectation damages. Relevant law. Restate. Second of Contracts SS 347. Measure of damages in case of breach of contract. Question 12. In the scenario involving an online retail platform, the customer places an order for an expensive electronic device under an agreement that includes a clause stating the device will be shipped within 5 business days. The device is shipped late, and the customer experiences frustration due to their urgent need for the product. The customer seeks to cancel the order and demand a full refund. Which legal principle most effectively applies to determination of the customer's right to cancel the contract and seek refund? A. Breach of contract and right to cancel. B. Promissory estoppel. C. Unilateral mistake. D. Impossibility of performance. Answer A. Breach of contract and right to cancel. Explanation. The agreement stipulates a specific delivery timeline, and failure to meet that timeline is the breach of contract. As the delivery was late and the customer had an urgent need for the device, they are likely entitled to cancel the contract and demand a refund under the breach of contract rule. The late delivery frustrates the purpose of the contract and gives the customer the right to cancel. Estoppel B applies when a party makes a promise that another party relies on and the relying party suffers harm. It is not directly relevant here, as the issue is about a breach of the delivery schedule rather than reliance on a promise. Unilateral mistake C occurs when one party is mistaken about a material fact in the contract, but there is no indication of a mistake in this scenario. Impossibility of performance D would apply. Delivery was rendered impossible, but here it was simply late, not impossible. Relevant law. Uniform Commercial Code SS2 601. Buyer's rights on improper delivery and restatement. Second of Contracts SS 237. Effect on other parties, duties of failure to render performance. Question 13. In a high-stakes environment where multiple challenges impact the timely execution of a large government contract, a contractor submits an invoice for services rendered that exceeds the original terms. The government agency acknowledges the receipt of the services but disputes the amount, arguing that the invoice includes services that were not specified in the contract. The contractor contends that the additional services were agreed upon during the project execution. Given the dispute, what rules would apply to determine if the contractor is entitled to the additional amount, and how would the terms of the original contract affect the outcome? A. The parallel evidence rule, which excludes oral agreements made after the written contract, would prevent the contractor from claiming the additional amount. B. The statute of frauds would require the contractor to present a written document to prove the additional services were agreed upon. C. The contract's terms and the doctrine of equitable estoppel would allow the contractor to claim the additional amount due to the reliance on the verbal agreement. D. The image rule would require the contractor's invoice to match the terms of the contract exactly, and any discrepancy would invalidate the invoice. Answer A. The parallel evidence rule, which excludes oral agreements made after the written contract, would prevent the contractor from claiming the additional amount. Explanation. Under the parallel evidence rule, once a contract is written and executed, any oral agreements made prior to or during the performance of the contract that contradict or alter the written terms are generally inadmissible in court. The contractor's verbal agreement regarding additional service would typically not be enforceable if the written contract did not specify them. The contract terms would govern, and any deviation must be explicitly included in an amended contract or supported by a modification clause. Question 14. While analyzing the root causes of sequential problems in a supply chain, a company discovers that one of its suppliers delivered defective materials. The company had signed a contract with the supplier specifying that the materials must meet particular quality standards. However, the supplier argues that the company waived its right to enforce these standards when it continued accepting deliveries without complaint for several months. What principle or doctrine would govern whether the company can still enforce the contract's quality standards? A. The statute of frauds would prevent the company from enforcing quality standards if there was no written contract modification. B. The doctrine of waiver would allow the supplier to avoid liability for defective materials as the company continued accepting deliveries without objecting. C. The doctrine of substantial performance would allow the company to enforce the contract because the supplier largely met its obligations despite some defects. D. The evidence rule would exclude any waiver defense based on verbal agreements not reflected in the written contract. Answer B. The doctrine of waiver would allow the supplier to avoid liability for defective materials as the company continued accepting deliveries without objecting. Explanation. The doctrine of waiver applies when one party knowingly relinquishes a right by failing to assert it in a timely manner. In this case, if the company continued accepting defective materials without complaint, it could be seen as waiving its right to enforce the specified quality standard, especially if it did not notify the supplier of any issues in a reasonable time frame. The company's inaction could be considered as an implicit acceptance of the supplier's performance. Question 15. During a comprehensive review of a process that needs improvement, a company notices that one of its employees signed a contract for services but failed to disclose an existing conflict of interest that might affect their impartiality. The other party to the contract seeks to rescind the contract on the grounds of non-disclosure. What legal concept would apply in determining whether the contract can be rescinded, and how does the principle of disclosure affect the enforceability of the contract? A. The principle of unconscionability would allow rescission because one party was unfairly disadvantaged due to non-disclosure. B. The doctrine of duress would apply as the employee's failure to disclose could be seen as coercion. C. The doctrine of mutual mistake would allow the contract to be rescinded if both parties were unaware of the conflict of interest. D. The duty of full disclosure would apply, and the failure to disclose the conflict of interest could render contract voidable by the other party. Answer D. The duty of full disclosure would apply, and the failure to disclose the conflict of interest could render the contract voidable by the other party. Explanation. The duty of full disclosure requires both parties to the contract to share all material information that could influence the decision to enter into the contract. In this case, the employee's failure to disclose conflict of interest could be breach of this duty, making the contract voidable by the party. Failure to disclose such information can create grounds for rescission, especially if the non-disclosure affected the other party's decision-making. Question 16. In a scenario where efficiency decreases across multiple sectors of a company due to unresolved disputes over contract terms, one of the departments claims that the performance targets set forth in the contract are ambiguous. The contract language specifies certain deliverables, but no clear metric is defined for assessing whether the department has met its obligations. Which approach would a court typically use to resolve the ambiguity in the contract, and how would it affect the department's obligations under the contract? A. The plain meaning rule would be applied, and the department would be required to meet the contract's specifications based on the ordinary meaning of the language. B. The doctrine of contra pro forentum would be used interpreting the ambiguous terms in favor of the department. C. The parallel evidence rule would prevent any external evidence from being used to clarify the ambiguity in the contract. D. The doctrine of reasonable expectations would be applied, and the department would be held to the standard that reasonable person would expect from the contract's terms. Answer: D. The doctrine of reasonable expectations would be applied, and the department would be held to the standard that a reasonable person would expect from the contract's terms. Explanation: the doctrine of reasonable expectations is used when contractual terms are ambiguous, and it helps clarify what the parties reasonably expected based on their actions and the context surrounding the contract. If a contract term is unclear, the court will often interpret the term in a way that reflects what a reasonable person would have expected when the contract was signed. In this case, if the performance targets were ambiguous, the court would likely hold the department to the standard that would be reasonably expected based on the contract's context and industry norms. Question 17. When implementing new protocols in a shared environment, two companies agree to a contract that stipulates strict timelines for performance. However, one company fails to meet the deadlines, claiming that an unforeseen natural disaster prevented them from complying. The other company seeks to terminate the contract for breach. Which legal principle would govern whether the breach is excused, and what factors would be considered in determining if the breach is excusable? A. The doctrine of impossibility would excuse the breach due to the unforeseen natural disaster. B. The doctrine of frustration of purpose would apply if the purpose of the contract was completely undermined by the natural disaster. C. The doctrine of impracticability would excuse the breach, but only if it was demonstrated that performance was significantly more difficult or costly due to the disaster. D. The force majeure clause would allow for excusal of breach, provided that the clause specifically includes natural disasters as an excusable event. Answer: D. The force majeure clause would allow for excusal of the breach, provided that the clause specifically includes natural disasters as an excusable event. Explanation: the force majeure clause is often included in contracts to excuse performance in the event of extraordinary circumstances beyond the control of the parties, such as natural disasters. If such a clause is present in the contract and it explicitly includes natural disasters as an event that can excuse performance, then the company may be excused from its breach. If no such clause exists, the company may still argue for relief under doctrines such as impossibility or impracticability, depending on the severity of the disaster and its impact on performance. Question 18. While managing a hybrid approach where timing issues affect the completion of a joint venture agreement, one party claims that the other has failed to meet the contractual deadlines. The second party, however, argues that the deadlines were not strict, but rather indicative of a best effort standard. How would the court typically resolve the dispute regarding the nature of the deadlines in this case? A. The court would apply the doctrine of substantial performance and allow the second party to continue the contract if they had substantially met the deliverables. B. The court would likely rule in favor of the first party, holding the deadlines as strict and enforcing the contract's terms regardless of the circumstances. C. The court would apply the objective theory of contracts and interpret the deadlines based on the intent of the parties and industry standards. D. Court would likely apply the doctrine of impossibility to excuse the second party's failure to meet the deadlines if they could prove external factors impeded performance. Answer: C. The court would apply the objective theory of contracts and interpret the deadlines based on the intent of the parties and industry standards. Explanation: under the objective theory of contracts, a court looks at how a reasonable person would interpret the contract terms considering the context of the agreement, the conduct of the parties, and industry standards. If the parties disagree on whether the deadlines were strict or flexible, the court would interpret the contract based on the overall intentions of the parties, industry norms, and the specifics of the contract's language. Question 19. In an environment where different components must interact under a contractual agreement, one party performs its duties under the contract but alleges that the other party failed to comply with specific terms, particularly related to delivery timelines and specifications. What legal doctrine would the performing party rely on to argue that it has fulfilled its obligations, and how would the court determine whether the contract has been breached? A. The substantial performance doctrine would allow the performing party to argue that minor deviations from the contract do not constitute a breach. B. The mirror image rule would prevent the performing party from arguing it met its obligations unless it performed exactly according to the contract terms. C. The doctrine of impracticability would excuse the performing party's deviation from the contract due to unforeseen difficulties. D. The anticipatory repudiation would apply if the non-performing party indicated in advance that they would not comply with the contract terms. Answer: A. The substantial performance doctrine would allow the performing party to argue that minor deviations from the contract do not constitute a breach. Explanation: the substantial performance doctrine holds that a party can still fulfill its contractual obligations if it performs most of the contract terms, even if there are minor deviations. If the deviations are not material and do not affect the overall purpose of the contract, the party may argue that they have substantially performed, and the non-performance may not constitute a breach. Question 20. While implementing backup procedures across various departments, a company finds that one of its partners has failed to honor the terms of a non-compete agreement providing services to a competitor in violation of the contract. What legal remedy would the company seek, and what factors would the court consider when determining the appropriateness of the remedy? A. The company would seek liquidated damages, and the court would assess the reasonableness of the clause. B. The company would seek specific performance, requiring the partner to stop working for the competitor. C. The company would seek rescission of the contract, ending the agreement and returning any benefits already received. D. The company would seek an injunction preventing the partner from continuing to violate the non-compete clause. Answer: D. The company would seek an injunction preventing the partner from continuing to violate the non-compete clause. Explanation: an injunction is a common remedy for contract violations, especially in cases involving non-compete clauses. The court would consider whether the non-compete agreement is reasonable in terms of scope, duration, and geography. If the non-compete is enforceable, the court may issue an injunction to stop the partner continuing to work for the competitor, protecting the company's interests. Question 21. In a large organization where multiple departments need to coordinate, one department agrees to supply another department with critical materials under a contract. The supplier department fails to deliver on time, which causes delays in the dependent department's work. The dependent department claims that the failure to deliver is a material breach. What factors would the court consider in determining whether the supplier's constitutes a material breach, and what consequences might arise from this failure? A. The court would consider the doctrine of substantial performance, and the dependent department would only be entitled to damages for minor delays. B. The court would consider whether the delay was significant enough to undermine the purpose of the contract, potentially allowing the dependent department to terminate the contract and seek damages. C. The court would apply the doctrine of anticipatory repudiation, even though the supplier did not clearly state and not perform. D. The court would consider the supplier's financial difficulties and apply the doctrine of impossibility to excuse the breach. Answer: B. The court would consider whether the delay was significant enough to undermine the purpose of the contract, potentially allowing the dependent department to terminate the contract and seek damages. Explanation: a material breach occurs when one party's failure to perform significantly undermines the contract's purpose. In this case, the supplier's failure to deliver critical materials could disrupt the dependent department's operations, potentially undermining the entire contract. The court would assess the severity of the delay, its impact on the dependent department, and whether the delay goes to the heart of the contract. If the breach is material, the dependent department may have the right to terminate the contract and seek damages. The doctrine of substantial performance would not apply here, as the failure is too significant to be considered substantial. Question 22. During a critical transition period where existing processes are being restructured, a company enters into a contract with a consultant to manage the transition. The consultant, however, fails to meet several key milestones outlined in the contract, and the company wants to terminate the agreement and seek damages. What legal principle would typically apply in this case, and what must the company prove to successfully terminate the contract, seek remedies? A. The principle of anticipatory breach applies because the consultant's failure to meet milestones suggests they will not fulfill the contract in the future. B. The company can terminate under the principle of frustration of purpose, as the consultant's failure undermines the entire purpose of the agreement. C. The principle of substantial performance applies, and the company can only seek damages for minor delays, not termination. D. The principle of impossibility applies, excusing the consultant from performance due to external factors beyond their control. Answer: A. The principle of anticipatory breach applies because the consultant's failure to meet milestones suggests they will not fulfill the contract in the future. Explanation: the principle of anticipatory breach occurs when one party indicates, through actions or words, that they will not perform their obligations under the contract. In this case, the consultant's failure to meet critical milestones is clear indication that they may not fulfill their contract obligations. This gives the company the right to terminate the contract early and seek damages for any losses incurred. The principle of frustration of purpose would not apply unless unforeseen external circumstances make the purpose of the contract impossible to achieve. Substantial performance would not apply here due to the consultant's failure to meet essential terms. An impossibility would only apply if external factors genuinely prevented performance. Question 23. When dealing with a complex system that shows occasional issues with one department's delivery impacting multiple other departments, company has entered into a contract with an external supplier for the supply of parts essential for manufacturing. However, the supplier delivers parts that do not meet the contract specifications. The company is considering rejecting the parts. Which principle should the company consider when determining whether they right to reject the parts, and what must they show to justify rejection? A. The principle of substantial performance would apply, meaning the company can only reject the parts if they fail to meet an essential requirement of the contract. B. The principle of anticipatory repudiation applies, as the supplier's failure to meet specifications signals an unwillingness to perform in the future. C. The company can reject the parts under the doctrine of perfect tender if the parts do not conform exactly to the contract terms. D. Company is required to accept the parts due to the implied covenant of good faith and fair dealing in the contract. Answer. C. The company can reject the parts under the doctrine of perfect tender if the parts do not conform exactly to the contract terms. Explanation. Under the Uniform Commercial Code, the doctrine of perfect tender allows a buyer to reject goods if they do not conform exactly to the contract's specifications. If the parts delivered by the supplier do not meet the agreed upon specifications, the company has the right to reject them and conforming goods. The principle of substantial performance would not apply because it does not justify rejection of goods that fail to conform to the agreed terms. Anticipatory repudiation would be applicable if the supplier explicitly indicated they would not be able to fulfill the contract, but that is not the case here. The implied covenant of good faith and fair dealing requires parties to act honestly, but it does not force the company to accept something. Question 24. In a high-stakes environment where multiple challenges arise, a company has entered into a contract with a contractor to build a new facility. Due to unforeseen weather conditions, the contractor requests an extension of time to complete the work. The company is hesitant as they need the facility completed by the original deadline. What legal doctrine or principle governs whether the contractor can be granted an extension, and what factors should consider? A. The doctrine of frustration of purpose would apply, excusing the contractor's delay due to the unforeseen weather conditions. B. The principle of force majeure applies, and the contractor may be entitled to an extension if the weather conditions qualify as an unforeseen event outside their control. C. The doctrine of anticipatory repudiation applies, allowing the company to terminate the contract due to potential delays. D. The principle of performance applies, and the contractor can complete the project as soon as possible with no need for an extension. Answer. B. The principle of force majeure applies, and the contractor may be entitled to an extension if the weather conditions qualify as an unforeseen event outside their control. Explanation. The principle of force majeure applies when an unforeseeable event or circumstance prevents a party from fulfilling its contractual obligations. In this case, the weather conditions qualified as a force majeure event that may entitle the contractor to an extension. Justify the extension, the contractor must prove that the weather event was beyond their control and directly impacted their ability to perform. The doctrine of frustration of purpose would apply if the weather completely rendered the contract impossible to perform, but an extension is more appropriate here. Anticipatory repudiation would only apply if the contractor refused to perform and substantial performance does not excuse delays due to external factors. Question 25. While investigating a complicated issue between different departments in an organization, the department has entered into a contract with an external software vendor to develop a custom solution. The vendor fails to deliver the software on time, and the department wishes to claim damages. What legal principle would apply in determining whether the delay constitutes a breach of contract, and what steps should the department maximize their chances of claiming damages? A. The department should rely on the doctrine of substantial performance and prove that the vendor's delay did not substantially affect the outcome of the contract. B. The department can claim damages based on anticipatory breach, as the vendor's failure to meet the delivery deadline indicates they will not fulfill their obligations in the future. C. The department may claim damages under the doctrine of material breach if the delay causes significant disruption to the department's operations. D. The department is barred from claiming damages due to the implied covenant of good faith and fair dealing in the contract. Answer: C. The department may claim damages under the doctrine of material breach if the delay causes significant disruption to the department's operations. Explanation: material breach occurs when party fails to perform their contractual obligations in a way that significantly impacts the contract's purpose. In this case, the department's operations are disrupted by the vendor's delay, potentially justifying claim for damages. The department demonstrate that the delay is not minor deviation from the contract, but significant failure to perform as agreed. Substantial performance would not apply if the vendor's delay undermines the core purpose of the contract. Anticipatory breach would apply if the vendor indicated they would not meet future obligations, and the implied covenant of good faith and fair dealing would not bar the claim for damages in this context. Question 26. In a situation where formal requirements conflict with practical considerations, the company has agreed to a contract with a supplier for the delivery of raw materials within a set time frame. The supplier is unable to meet the exact delivery date due to unforeseen circumstances. However, the materials delivered are of the specified quality. How should the company handle the situation legally, and what are their options regarding performance under the contract? A. The company must reject the goods, as the delivery date is a fundamental part of the contract and must be strictly adhered to. B. The company may accept the goods and negotiate a new delivery schedule, possibly waiving the breach if they agree to an amended timeline. C. The company may only accept the goods if they are of perfect quality, regardless of the delivery delay. D. The company must terminate the contract, as any delay is a breach of material terms of the contract, regardless of quality. Answer: B. The company may accept the goods and negotiate a new delivery schedule, possibly waiving the breach if they agree to an amended timeline. Explanation: in contracts, time is often an important factor, but unless the delivery date is explicitly stated as time is of the essence, the company may be able to accept the late delivery and negotiate a new timeline. Since the supplier delivered goods of the required quality, the company has the option waive the breach if it's not material breach and work out an amended agreement including new terms for delivery. Strict adherence to the delivery date would only be required if the contract specifically highlighted the time-sensitive nature. Question 27. During an emergency response where multiple areas are impacted, a contractor has been hired to perform critical repairs on an infrastructure project. Due to unexpected external factors, the contractor delays the repairs significantly and the project owner is considering suing for breach of contract. What factors should the project owner consider in determining whether the contractor's actions justify termination of the contract? A. The contractor's delays may be justified if the external factors were unforeseen and beyond their control, possibly qualifying as force majeure event. B. The owner must allow the contractor additional time to perform, as delays are common in infrastructure projects and do not warrant termination. C. The contractor's actions could constitute anticipatory repudiation if the delays were substantial and indicated that the contractor would not future deadlines. D. The owner has no grounds for termination unless the contractor has been explicitly warned the delays will lead to breach of contract. Answer: A. The contractor's delays may be justified if the external factors were unforeseen and beyond their control, possibly qualifying as force majeure event. Explanation: force majeure clauses may excuse party from performance if external factors, such as severe weather or other unforeseen events, prevent timely performance. If these factors are genuine and beyond the contractor's control, the owner may not have the right to terminate the contract unless the delays severely impact the overall purpose of the contract. Anticipatory repudiation applies if the contractor indicates they will not fulfill future obligations, which doesn't seem to be the case here. The owner should consider if the delays are truly due to circumstances outside the contractor's control. Question 20. While analyzing the root causes of sequential problems in a project, the company has engaged a third-party consultant to identify weaknesses in its supply chain process. The consultant presents a report that outlines several potential issues, but does not include a clear action plan or timeline for addressing them. The company is considering whether to hold the consultant accountable for not delivering a comprehensive solution. Legal principles might apply, and what should the company do to seek accountability? A. The company should hold the consultant accountable for breach of contract based on their failure to provide a clear plan and timeline. B. The company must accept the consultant's report as is, as it provides an analysis of the problems without the need for further details. C. The company may be able to claim damages under the principle of substantial performance if the report was not fully comprehensive. D. The company should request meeting to the consultant's deliverables and clarify the expectations outlined in the contract. Answer. D. The company should request a meeting to discuss the consultant's deliverables and clarify the expectations outlined in the contract. Explanation. Before considering legal action, the company should first communicate with the consultant to clarify the expectations set in the contract and determine if the lack of clear action plan and timeline is an oversight or if the consultant is unwilling to meet those obligations. This approach allows for the possibility of renegotiating terms or setting new deliverables, which could resolve the issue without resorting to breach of contract claims. The company should focus on addressing the issue directly before considering claims for damages or breach based on the consultant's performance. Question 29. In a multi-location scenario where consistency requirements must be maintained across different branches, a company has signed a contract with a logistics provider to ensure that all locations receive supplies on time. However, one of the branches regularly faces delays due to local regulatory restrictions. What should the company do to address the issue and ensure compliance with the contract? A. The company should terminate the contract and find a new logistics provider that can ensure timely delivery to all locations. B. The company should negotiate an extension with the provider to allow for regulatory delays, but hold the provider accountable for non-compliance with the overall timeline. C. The company should work with local regulators to remove the restrictions and enforce the original delivery terms in the contract. D. The company must accept the delays as part of the logistics provider's performance and waive the delays as an unavoidable circumstance. Answer. B. The company should negotiate an extension with the provider to allow for regulatory delays, but hold the provider accountable for non-compliance with the overall timeline. Explanation. In this situation, the company should engage in negotiations with the logistics provider to adjust the delivery schedule while accounting for the regulatory restrictions that cause delays. The company may want to update the contract to reflect realistic timelines. Should also hold the provider accountable for any non-compliance with the broader terms of the agreement. While the regulatory delays may be unavoidable, the logistics provider is still obligated to meet the contract's general performance requirements unless explicitly excused by force majeure or similar clauses. Question 30. In a situation where resource allocation becomes a critical issue, a company has contracted with an external vendor to supply necessary components for a product line. However, the vendor faces a sudden resource shortage and is unable to fulfill the order as agreed. The company is considering whether to terminate the contract or renegotiate the terms. What factors should the company evaluate before making a decision, and which principle? A. The company should immediately terminate the contract under the doctrine of frustration of purpose, as the vendor cannot fulfill their obligations. B. The company should evaluate the possibility of force majeure or resource allocation clauses and negotiate a new delivery schedule or alternative solutions with the vendor. C. The company is required to accept the vendor's new timeline, as resource shortages are not grounds for contract termination. The company should continue to work with the vendor without changes, as resource issues are common risk in such contracts. Answer. B. The company should evaluate the possibility of force majeure or resource allocation clauses and negotiate a new delivery schedule or alternative solutions with the vendor. Explanation. The company should first assess whether the vendor's resource shortage qualifies as force majeure event, which may excuse the vendor from performance under certain circumstances. If not, the company should look at the contract's resource allocation clauses to see adjustments can be made. Negotiating revised delivery schedule or seeking an alternative solution could prevent the company from needing to terminate the contract. Termination should only occur if the breach is material and cannot be mitigated.